Hi.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Zap talk that we're hosting tonight. Thank you very much for everyone who has tuned in. Apologies that it's a bit dark here on my side. As you know, in South Africa, we have this thing called load shedding, which happens, but thank goodness for inverters. So yeah, tonight we have a talk on 10 principles behind a great product team by Roger Norton, who I'll introduce briefly in a moment. But yeah, first and foremost, just to make this possible, it wouldn't be possible to do this without our sponsors. We have four main sponsors: Code Capsules, who is a platform as a service product and really, really cool to host your products on. IO, Digital Product Builders, CodeSpace, which they're a coding and technology education school, and then NML, who's a financial service software development company. And we really are thankful for their contributions to both FETSA and Zapt. And we really just want to give a shout out to them. So go ahead and check out their websites to see what they do and just to see the awesome people that they are. Tonight, our talk will be hosted or done by Roger Norton, and he's currently the CPO at OK Hi. I'm not going to read through this whole thing. You're welcome to pause the video and read this, and Roger will also have a chance to say something about himself in a moment. Roger is a cool guy. He's really friendly, and I really want to encourage everyone to engage with him during the talk. I was privileged enough to be his neighbor for a few months, so I can really vouch for this oak. But yeah, talking about engaging, you are more than welcome to pop questions into the comments. So you're obviously watching this on YouTube. If you have a question or a comment, just pop it into the YouTube comment section and we will see it on the side and we can display it on the screen when appropriate. And then also Roger will be asking for some input during his talk. Please engage. It would be really cool just to make this sort of engaging, that it's not just a one-way show. We'll definitely have a sort of dedicated Q&A section at the end as well, but feel free to pop your questions in the comments during. That's it from my side. Now I am going to hand over to Roger and yeah, enjoy.
Great, thanks, Charles. Firstly, hi everybody, I'm Roger. I'm going to be presenting in my video feed. So if you're watching, if you need to pin this video or watch what this is where it's going to be. Most of the information is going to be right over here. I do have the chat open, so I will be asking some questions and getting some interaction in the session. Please do engage. If you have questions in the middle of it, pop through. I might stop, otherwise I'll pick them up at the end. But please do engage when we go through that. Maybe to dive off, get started a little bit about me. So as of about 3 weeks ago, I'm CPO at OK Hi. Before that, I was at a venture builder called Founders Factory Africa. And I've worked a lot with startups and very early product teams, both in venture builders, a startup studio. I've been a founder myself a couple of times. And I've helped about 70 different early stage product teams work out what it is they need to build things, launch them, get them to market, and really work out how to build early teams and build and launch early products. So a lot of the context that this is coming from that. So that's my bias. I've also written 2 books around Start Here and the Lean Iterator Playbook, which is all around idea validation and what that looks like. You can find out more online. But to dive right in, I think that where the topic of this talk comes from is I very often get this kind of question, whether it's this one exactly or not. Is, should we use Scrum? Should we use Kanban? Like when do we use this tool or that tool, or how do we get better as a team? Or similarly, like, do we do journey mapping or value maps, and what does that look like? And the problem with those kinds of questions is the answer always is the same. It depends. It depends on a great many things. It depends on the culture of the team. It depends on your experience, the personalities involved, industry clients, and a number of other factors that take into account. And some of those have big influences. Some of them have small influences. But there's a lot of variables that you need to consider. And so in trying to help teams answer these questions and work through this kind of reasoning, I've come up with a framework on how I've found it most effective to look at what this is. And for me, it matters the most about where your team is the weakest. You should never pick up a tool just for the sake of using a tool. You should never adopt a framework or a philosophy or an approach just because that's the cool in thing to do, or because that's what they're doing in Silicon Valley. We should always do it because it's going to help our team get better at what they need to do. And that's an interesting phrase, because better, what does better mean? What does a better team look like? How do you get better? What is that metric? And so it's one of those things of like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like, whatever your team is really good at already is probably not something you need to fix. And so by focusing on the weakest areas, you can ideally improve. And so then it comes to the question of, how do we work out, what is the rubric of where we identify where and how our team is weak, and use that as a way to identify which kinds of interventions, tools, frameworks, methodologies will actually help us perform better as a team, and deliver as that. So that's really what this talk is about. And so the first interactive part of this talk is throw in some ideas of what does an ideal team look like to you. When I say the word ideal team, throw your answer in the chat or in the YouTube comment section. Add in there, like, what is an ideal team? What are some characteristics of an ideal team? I'll give it 30 seconds while those come in, hopefully. What does the best team look like to you? Well, Joz, I don't know if you can see those come through, or Liesel, if you can see them come through into the thing. Collaborative, cross-functional is one. Anyone else? Nice on a cold Monday evening, get your fingers typing. What is an ideal team? What does that look like? Complementary members. Hopefully they are very complimentary and very quiet, very polite. Self-organizing. Yep, there's another one. Let's go one more. Anyone? Yeah, open, comfortable, communicative, awesome people. Yeah, there we go. So Marty Kagan, who's from the Silicon Valley Product Group, one of the thought leaders in this, he's actually written 2 books exactly around this topic, Inspired and Empowered, and it's around how you build and develop product teams, how they come together. And as you can see in the chat, a lot of these things are not new. They're not. They're all relatively cliche, actually. Like, what is a self-organizing team, or a complementary team, or cross-functional? Like, we hear these words bandied about and thrown around. It's like, I've got a list of the 10 principles of high-performing teams that I kind of just a loose rubric of how I throw those together. And I'm going to pull it up now, but it's not. This is not like unique IP that I've generated. These are all, as you can see. We all kind of intuitively know this. We all know what a good team looks like. We all know, like, the phrases or the mentalities or the approaches of what an effective team needs to look like. I'm not here to tell you what that is. What we're going to do today is look at, how do we use that? How do we understand what those are? And then how do we use that in a decision making in order to evaluate tools and what that looks like? So if there's one thing you take away from today, that's what I'm hoping it is. But anyway, without further ado, here is the, well, let me go this way. Here is the 10 items, 10 principles. As you will see, I'm going to go dig into each one in a bit more detail. So, but none of those are massively different to what you guys have been typing into the chat. They're all relatively cliches. But what I'm going to do for each one is highlight where I think most people get it wrong. And then at the end, we're going to wrap up with and how you use that as a comparison list. So while I'm doing this, the second piece of interactivity for this talk is for you to rate your team. So reflect on your team. So when I'm running through one of the principles, give yourself a rating of 1 to 10. 1 is we kind of suck at this. 10 is our team is the perfect example of how to implement this. And then we'll wrap up those scores at the end, and you can see how we'll use a bit of a reflection on it. But just write like number 1 with a score next to it, number 2 down to 10. So if you need to grab a piece of pen and paper or a little chat box or something, now's the time to do that. So diving right in, we're looking like starting off with metrics and measurement. And where I see most people going wrong on this is, firstly, they're not tracking anything at all. And so like the first mistake is that people actually just aren't tracking enough data around what they're doing, and they're running purely on instinct. But if you're not actually measuring something, it's very difficult to improve. And so the first step we need to do is look at, like, do we have proper metrics in place? Do we have effective measurement of what that looks like? And the important points on this is that, are those metrics actionable? And the way you ask that is, if this number goes up or if the number goes down, what would I do differently? What is the action I would take off the back of that number and off the back of that metric moving? And if the answer is, well, there's no real clear action you could do, like if you get more Facebook likes, what are you going to do differently? Nothing really. Try better next time. But so that's kind of what we classify as a vanity metric. Things like a conversion rate going up or going down has a direct correlation to, like, oh, I need to change the copy on the previous page or update that. And then the second point around this is, like, often people are just tracking, like, a Google Analytics, or you track page views or raw numbers coming in, but it's not. It's like knowing that 5,000 people visited the website is less valuable than knowing that out of the 5,000 people that visit the website, 3,000 clicked on this button to go into the next step, or like whatever that conversion is. So you always want to be looking at your metrics and your numbers in cohorts, looking at how do you evaluate it, comparing week on week or different journeys. So people who came in from this source versus that source, people who joined this week versus last week, or this month versus last month, people who've gone through these steps versus people who went through other steps. And you want to compare the metrics or measurements normally within in cohorts as comparison, as percentage increase, percentage decrease. And those become far more actionable in what they look at. The second point is of customer centricity. Another one, it's like, yay for customer centricity, but what does that actually mean? And so few teams, like, everyone says they're customer centric, but so few teams are actually engaging with customers on a regular basis and having members across the team engaging with it. So one of a quick hack that I found pretty useful in setting this up is, firstly, just to put a block in the diary. So put a 2-hour block at least. If you're not doing anything, that's a good start. Every week, put a 2-hour block of interview customers, or UER, or whatever you want to call it. And then set up a Calendly link with where customers, that you can send to customers, that they can book slots in specifically that window. And so by doing that, and I've seen some companies have tied that into their onboarding sign-up flow, or like, would you like to provide feedback? Here's a link, book a slot. And so you can make sure that by the time that time block comes, you're not scrambling to try and find people to interview then, but those interviews are already lined up. So you want to try and automate that as much as possible in order to get FaceTime with the customers. And another problem that people make is they separate the engineers that don't engage with the customers. And this is all too common, and engineers absolutely hate it. But really the purpose of engaging engineers and customers is trying to get the person who will fix the problem as close to the person who has the problem as possible. For every step of person, or every degree of separation between that, you're diluting the insights and the ability for that engineer to actually comprehensively understand and solve that problem. And so including those engineers is more around tightening that loop. It's about the engineer seeing where they struggle and then thinking about the technical architecture in a way that a product manager or product designer will never be able to actually resolve it. To say, actually, we can think so. I'm not saying only send engineers, but they should definitely be part of those conversations as well. And then the last point around here is that, like, a common mistake that people say is like, oh, we're very customer centric. We ask the customers what they want, and then we build that. And that's exactly what you don't want to do. Customers are great at communicating their context. They're great at communicating their problems, their motivations, their experience of coming into coming into solving the problem. But they can't tell you what the solution is. And the reason that you should never build what the customers actually ask for is because they're only looking at it through one lens, and that's their lens. But anything that makes it onto your roadmap or actually gets shipped needs to be taken. Some other factors need to be taken into account. And specifically, those are things like, how does that make money for us? How does it tie into our larger tech stack? How does that create network effects for our ultimate goal of our competitive edge of what how we're trying to differentiate? All of those lenses that are business or tech related are not in the customer's mind, and anything they come up with is going to be a pure solution. So I've got a longer blog post on this, but it's really around understanding, using customer interviews to understand context and experience, but not solutions. Take the solutions with a massive pinch of salt. The third principle is learning loops and experimentation. And this is kind of that whole lean startup, build, measure, learn, fun and games. But what a lot of people get wrong is the lean startup, they think lean as in skinny, as in spending little money and not running fast enough. And the context of the lean startup actually comes from lean manufacturing and the Toyota production system, if you go a bit further back. And what that was is a production line of machines, and they're all running at different varying throughputs. And lean manufacturing's philosophy was that if every node in that production line is running at its capacity, by definition, your production line is not running at capacity or not running efficiently, because invariably there'll be one machine that runs a little bit slower than the machine before it, or a little bit faster than the machine after it, and that's going to create a buildup of widgets directly before or after that system. And that buildup of widgets is waste. It's waste in the system. So lean manufacturing actually slows the entire production line down to the rate of the lowest or the slowest bottleneck, which means that as soon as a widget comes out of one machine, it's ready to go into the next, and the entire production line runs incredibly efficiently with minimal waste. And so when you apply that to the lean startup, what it's really around optimizing for is rate of learning. You want to learn as quickly as possible. And in the early days in particular, with a small idea, often shipping quickly, like not overcomplicating it, not overbuilding, actually does increase your rate of learning. You just ship faster and get that cycle time really fast. But you normally reach a point when you actually need to start spending more money in order to keep learning faster and keep learning at a certain rate. You need to hire more people. You need to pay for ads to reach larger audiences or run larger experiments. And so often if you just focus on like, oh, we're running lean, means we're not spending money, you're probably not learning fast enough. And that's the whole point, is around learning loops and experimentations. And the other thing that I often see with experiments is people say like, oh, we're experimenting all the time and we have a whole bunch of hypotheses, but they never define what any good scientific experiment actually needs, which is a hypothesis, a method, a measurement method, and a success criteria. So what are we trying to validate or invalidate? How are we going to run this test? What are we going to measure? And we are right if we get over the certain level. Strategizer with their test cards is a great little formula for that. But so rarely do I see teams actually documenting those 4 things before they run experiments. And so what happens is you look backwards and go, oh, we ran this experiment and the output was this, so therefore we kind of assume we always knew that. And without putting a peg in the ground at the start, you don't have that comparison to see what you've actually learned. And so you just kind of assume you always knew those things, and you lose on that rate of learning. You're minimizing that learning. The fourth one is around being instinct informed and data validated. This is like not being data driven. Like in my experience, very few teams are actually fully data driven. Like they'll have an intuition or an inclination about where they think a problem is, and then they'll go and find data to validate it. And that's a much more healthy approach to it, because once again, you're applying a lens to where you think there's a problem, or you're processing data with looking for anomalies with a certain lens. And once you find that, you can then run the experiment or find the data to justify or validate or invalidate that intuition or that instinct. And that's a much healthier path in how to run. It doesn't help to just look at the data and try and run your business purely off data, because it's totally emotional and it's totally random as well. And I always like this phrase that startup founders are all a little delusional, and they kind of have to be, right? They see something or have want to invent something that nobody else can see, and that's like the definition of delusion. But data is how you don't get lost in the delusion. So data is how you validate. You can have this intuition about this amazing thing you want to build, but the stronger your conviction, or the most obvious it seems to you, the easier it should be to test. The easier it should be to find the data that backs that up. And so that's kind of where the experimentation and these two sort of tie together. It is not just running on data. It's about having the instinct first and then delivering through. And a lot of that is also whenever your teams, like a lot of teams go on the other side where they're just completely running, and in Nigeria call it the OGG, the ogre-driven development, which is like a big chief-driven development, that the big chief just decides what needs to get built and everyone else just runs ahead and delivers it. But the easiest way to counter that is to ask why. or why are we doing this? What else did we consider? How do we know that this is the right option? How do we know that this is true? What is the data that's underpinning this? And often by asking that, you can highlight when people are just driving what they think versus what they've actually justified with data in how they do that. The fifth one is outcomes over outputs, another huge trendy product phrase, if you would, around looking at what you do. But it's really around value delivery over feature delivery. Instead of just checking tick boxes off of features that you're shipping, it's more around focusing the value that you actually deliver, and specifically focusing around value creation and value capture. So that's when I'm working with teams looking at like new systems or how they unpack stuff. Those are typically the two areas that we want to unpack the most. When do we create the value, and when do we capture the value, and how we unpack that. And it kind of comes down to this whole thesis that nobody wants a mortgage, right? Like people want a house. Nobody wants a hole in the wall. They want a picture house. And so it's looking at like what are we trying to achieve, and how do you keep that front and center in the team, and in the way you're writing user stories, and in the way you're measuring tasks, and the way you're setting your roadmaps. How do you become more value focused? The Jobs to be Done framework is a great one by the Christensen Institute, looking at like what is the want that people have, and then what are the jobs that they need to do in order to deliver on that want. Like what is the intrinsic value that they're trying to receive from it. And counterintuitively, a lot of people try and be solution focused, and us in product are often very solution focused, and we're always trying to jump to, this is what the answer must be. But being outcome focused over output focused means that you're actually problem focused. You're more focused on what the problem is, and that frees you up to consider multiple different solutions that could solve that problem. So by being more problem focused, and being intentionally problem focused, and making sure this is the problem we're solving, not this is the solution we're going to ship, actually helps reframe or rephrase that, and gives your team permission to innovate and work around that. So you have that self-empowered product team, as they say. Quick glass of water halfway through. And then another one that I often see teams missing out on is a clear, concise vision. So we love these empowered, autonomous teams that can self-arrange, self-organize, and we saw a bunch of that coming through in the chat. But it's really about like teams can only do that when they have a really clear prioritization framework, or a really clear way of measuring what good looks like, or determining when they have two options in front of them. They're making 100 decisions a day. How are they deciding this option versus that option? What is the rubric or the metric or the evaluation criteria that they're being empowered with? And a lot of this comes down to vision, mission, master plan. Or it could be also used in a cultural aspect of like, these are our cultural values. This is so we make decisions within these cultural values. Or we have a strategic, like a master plan. It's looking at like, what is the next inflection point that we need to build into our products. What is the next inflection point in our business strategy that the products need to enable? And so then the product decisions become, well, how are we enabling that? Which of these options that we could build is going to get us to that output, or help us contribute towards that strategic inflection point most effectively? So creating that decision-making framework is really, really critical for the wider team. Another one that as we move sort of away from water flow and move into the more agile world, the biggest problem people come in, and like when you have roadmaps without timelines and those sorts of things, is how do you actually acknowledge uncertainty? We're building in software in general, and I'm assuming most people watching this are working in software in some way, shape, or form, but it's like building this invisible house. We're building like programs out of code. It's this invisible house in our head with plumbing and walls and systems that are all interconnected, and we're trying to knock down a wall and add on a new room or add a new bathroom or make a whole bunch of changes. And every time something moves, it's impossible to deliver, like work out all the repercussions of that. And if you compare that to builders in the real world, when everything is known, everything is tangible, you can touch things, you can pick them up, you can measure things, they still can't get the building done on time. They still don't ever finish a building project or renovation project on time. And so when we're working with these invisible houses, how can you possibly expect people to get there. And most of the time is because people don't acknowledge the uncertainty in what they're doing. I always like this tweet by Aline Nerso, which is like, if you commit to a year's worth of roadmap, it's like saying that you're not going to learn anything new that year. And that normally becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that's an interesting counter to this idea of when business or the CEOs or your investors or your board is wanting certainty on what you're going to deliver and when, and the team has this tension around, how do we know that's the right thing? What happens if we learn new information? Are we being adaptable? Are we actually changing to new information? And so it's that wiggle room and that tension that you often need to deal with. And one of the hacks that I found to try and resolve this is to always quote in ranges. When I was running a startup studio and building tech for startups, I'd always would have a list of all the things we needed to build, and then I'd ask my developers to estimate how long they thought, and they would kind of become our minimum column. And then the maximum column we would add for complexity and uncertainty. So if it was a small task that we knew how to do, or it was relatively not complex, but we weren't quite sure how to do it, we'd up to double the value. Or if it was an incredible, we knew exactly how to solve the task, but it was quite complex, we'd double it. And so we end up with this range. And so what's interesting with that is when we chat with customers and say, oh, well, this feature would take between 5 and 12 weeks to build, invariably they would turn around and say, well, what? That's ridiculous. That's like a 250% margin. Like, why is there such a big range? And that's the right conversation, right? Now we're talking about uncertainty. We're talking about where the uncertainty is. We're talking about where the complexity is. And we can start addressing the software development from the point of compromise. We know, like, there's a bunch of things we don't know. There's a bunch of things we can't know. Let's build these 2 or 3 first, and we'll learn a lot more and be able to get more accurate on the rest. Or it also helps have conversations around, is it important to go really fast, or is it important to be very comprehensive? And where you draw the line with those things matters as well. So that's sort of acknowledging uncertainty. And then the last 2 or 3 are all kind of interrelated, and that's around shared accountability. It's around, you can have responsibility and different responsibilities in your team, but does the team have ownership around solving the problem, around actually delivering the value, and how you're thinking about that? And I've always liked the definition of responsible versus accountable. Is responsible is the ability to respond, and accountable is the person held to account. So if a developer or if a team member or product manager has the ability that when something comes up, when new information comes in, can they respond to it without needing outside approval, then they have responsibility. If their neck will be on the line when it goes wrong, then they have accountability. And so looking at, like, how do you create that shared accountability in a team, and how do you balance that? And if you are using the DASI or the RACI, which is a responsible, accountable, consulted and informed, is kind of the breakdown. If you were to look at that for your team, if you were to do a RACI or DASI, are they the same names under accountability all the way through? Is it always just the CEO or the CPO or whatever it is? And what are you thinking about as a team in how to delegate that accountability? And how do you delegate that responsibility around what that looks like? How do you create sort of subsections within, or responsibilities in how you deliver value that you can make certain people responsible for, and how you lean into that? The last one, second last one, is cross-functional inputs and decisions. So this is really just around, and we've touched on this a couple of times before, around shared accountability and around cross-functional teams, and getting input. But it really comes from the point that we are most blind to our own bias. And it goes beyond just engineers and designers. It goes into demographics, race, cultures, countries. Like, are you working from a diverse team? And if everyone on the team is making the same decisions from the same context with the same set of biases, they're going to miss the same things. And so the value of diversity is not just a checkbox in order to do it. It actually helps you make better decisions. It helps you create more robust products in how you're doing that. And another thing, if you're not running it, is to just kind of create a decision log of decisions that have been made. And what I often like to do with teams that are running those is to look through who made those last decisions, who was actually involved in that, and how diverse or how spread is that team, and what that looks like. And then the last one is sort of adaptability and empowerment, which is very much a bit of a catch-all, but it's really around how sort of small groups are what change the world. And like empowered small teams is what really gets there. And it's around how the handing over trust in an organization to be able to get out of people's way so that they can execute and they can deliver a good work without your approval, without you needing to be there. And are they actually empowered to respond on that? So those are the 10 principles. Like I said, none of those should be anything particularly new. But what I hope you've done is run through, and if you haven't done it yet, now is the time. Quick recap. Just rate your team on a scale of 1 to 10. How good or bad do you think you are at these different areas? I did work with someone at one point to create sort of, for each of these, create a series of questions that are weighted and with multiple choice questions that would answer something. But I've actually just found a 1 to 10 rating typically works more effectively. And so the question is, how did you do? How did your team do? And it's important to note here, it's not about a total score. It's not about like what's high. What we're normally looking for is most teams have 2 to 4 areas that they're weakest at. So there's 2 or 3 areas, like we're pretty bad at metrics and measurement. We're pretty bad at this. Some teams it's up to 5 or 6. But normally you'll have a couple that are 7 or 8s. A couple around 5 or 6, and a couple that are around 2 or 3. And so the 2 or 3 are the ones that you really want to work on. And so when you're thinking about a tool or a framework, you want to think about tools or frameworks that are going to help you improve those areas, to help your team become more like what an ideal team should look like. And so let me just run through. I've got 2 quick examples, and we'll open it up for questions and discussions. But two areas here is like going back to that very first question. The first one is like, should your team use Scrum or Kanban? So for those who don't know, Scrum is much more rigid, with rigid cycles. It's got quite clear roles. They're both ways in which you organize your backlog and deliver and manage your team delivery and who's working on what. But Scrum has a lot more hats of product owners and Scrum masters and much more titles. It's much more rigid in the cycle of things. Kanban is far more pull-based. So you'll have a backlog that's prioritized, and people operate on work in progress limits. So anyone can only be working on so many items at a task. And as long as the backlog is prioritized and they're always working on the top item until they get stuck and then have to move back into the list, it means that they're always working on the most important thing. And when they're done working on that most important thing, they pull the next most important thing. So it's much more pull-based, much more fluid, much more dynamic. And so if we look at these 2 approaches of like how to run your team or how to manage your way of work, these are kind of highlighting different areas in these principles. Scrum is far more rigid on metrics and measurement. There's actually it's like somebody who's the representative of the customer. There's a CEO of the product, and so you have a lot more like making sure that the customer's voice is heard in those things. It's a lot more around focusing on outcome and like how are we delivering value and what that looks like. Whereas Kanban kind of just gets on with it and gets on with the fluidity of it. But it's not trying to predict what we're going to get done in the next two weeks. It's just we're always going to be working on the most important thing. That's the most important thing. And so they acknowledge uncertainty better. It creates that kind of fluidity of identifying what's most important and making sure that you're working on the most important thing. Creates a shared accountability for the team where everyone can reflect and say, how am I going to add value by pulling items of this backlog? What am I going to do that can move that the most? And obviously the last 2, cross-functional inputs and adaptability, both of these frameworks will kind of help with that in one way or another in slightly different ways. So this is never an absolute, but typically if a team is weak at the metrics, measurements, and customer centricity or outcomes over output, like nudging towards Scrum, which is a little bit more structured, which is going to help them create the cadence, help them intentionally build in customer feedback or customer scoping sessions, is going to be better for them. But if it's a smaller team, they're pretty clear around what they need to do. They just need to get on and do it. Kanban's often a better way to just, it's very process-like. You can just start shipping value and delivering that and sort of experimenting and reprioritizing on the fly, not waiting every 2 weeks before you reprioritize. So that's kind of one way in which you can use to kind of use these principles to evaluate which kind of framework would be better for your tool, for your team. To pick another example that's a little more like a tool specific, that's more like framework and approach specific. This is more like tools. So looking at two tools in specifically now, next, later. So now, next, later follows it says now, next, and later. It's like 3 columns. The now is what we're currently working on. It's normally in very rich detail. The next is a little more fuzzy, and later is it's just some headings of what we're going to be prioritizing next. But typically what the now, next, later is it's always focused around value delivery or problems that you're solving for customers. And then under each one, you'll on any item that's in the now column, you'll have a lot of detail of like what it is, and then you'll list the number of experiments or ideas or things that you can try until you've achieved that outcome. Until that working on that thing is no longer the most important, you'll move it into a backlog and then pull something from the next column into what you're working on now. And so it encourages you to be much more fluid, keep iterating until you actually have delivered that value, and then move back. The second option, the one below that, is flight levels. The flight levels is the analogy they use is flying at 30,000 feet. You can see the mountains and the rivers and the coastline. When you fly at 15,000 feet, you can see the roads and the houses. And when you fly at 5,000 feet or 3,000 feet, you can see the dogs in the yard and the people walking in and out of their cars. And so that's kind of the general idea of flight levels. But the highest level is your strategic level of like, what are the big items? Where is the company going? What is the master plan, the inflection points? And we decide as an executive team of what's important. It then moves down into a coordination layer, which is how are the various teams, what initiatives are the various teams contributing towards? How does that work? And then it moves down into the actual task, and each team has a board with their actual tasks and items on it. Now, both of these can be used to run a backlog. They're both road mapping tools. You can plan what gets done. Both of them are going to have their pros and cons around that. So if you look at like comparing these two onto these frameworks, it's like the flight levels is once again much more rigid. It's going to give you the metrics and measurement and making sure what's being delivered, when you should be delivering it by, coordinating with other teams, that sort of thing. And sort of tying together sort of a clear, concise vision of like, we created a very clear strategic framework, and everyone knows how their team is contributing into the coordination layer, which contributes in. It creates shared accountability because everyone's on the same page of what's important. And the cross-functional teams is the whole thing is around coordinating in larger teams. Whereas the now, next, later is much more about the customer centricity around the learning loops, a bit more experimentation, focusing far more on outcomes, not outputs, and adaptability and that sort of thing. So that's kind of the breakdown of how you think, like even on a tool level, on a principle level, a tool level, a methodology level, you can generally tie these things into it to start evaluating which one's going to be more effective to help improve the areas that your team is the weakest at. I see a couple of questions in here. I'm just going to do a quick browse. Sure. So who should decide that the agile methodology should be dictated by the team or the organization? Or can it be a combined decision? What would make it difficult and what is always most difficult? So it's like, who makes a decision? I mean, this is once again like just a principle thing, right? Of looking at like, it's anyone can suggest this is what we should do and this is why I think we should do it. The person who generally comes in with the most robust, like, hey, I've evaluated our team. This is where I think we're weakest. This is why using Agile or using this particular framework of Agile, this particular flavor of Agile is going to help compensate for the areas where I think we're struggling. This is why we should use a tool. If you were a junior product person and you put together that logic that I've just run you through and presented that to a CPO or a C-suite, like, they're unlikely to push back unless they've had a really bad experience or they'll help you see something. But if you walk them through that logic of, this is how I evaluate our team, this is where I think we're weakest, this is the tool that can help compensate for that or give us a bit more rigidity or give us a bit more customer centricity or can create a bit more shared accountability in the team. I feel the tools we're using are too structured and too siloed. But by embracing this particular approach, we can kind of create more collaboration between the teams and create more shared accountability. That's the kind of, this isn't an exact science, but it's going to give you a framework on how you can think through the pros and cons in a better way, in a more structured way. And you can evaluate completely different tools or frameworks or approaches by looking at what they want. one thing, obviously, I can't run through every single possible example. So quick plug. I'm actually building a database of exactly these tools. So at the moment, there's about 20. I started about 2 weeks ago, but you can definitely contribute to it. But the idea is that you can actually filter by these, sorry, this way. You can filter by the various different principles and say, hey, what are tools, principles, or methodologies that focus on customer centricity? And then the list gets filtered down to whatever that those numbers look like. So if you head on over to bit.ly/toolsdb, you can actually go there. There's a couple up there right now. Feel free to add your own if you find it useful. And you can engage on that. So it's kind of, I'm slowly going to be building on this over time, where you can start creating a bit of framework or start getting some ideas of, hey, if we've identified these 2 or 3 areas we're weak at, these are the types of tools that we're going to want to dig into a bit later. So yeah, it's a Coda link that should be publicly available. Otherwise, the bit.ly link is easier to remember. And so what I'm really hoping from this talk is that next time you don't pick a tool or a framework or methodology just because it's cool, just because that's what you read in a blog post, but you pick a tool that really does make you better. You pick one that's going to help your team be more effective. And to answer that question I said is like, how do you know better? Like we all know what better is, right? We have a rough idea of the principles around what great teams should look like. But very rarely do we actually use those principles and use that knowledge to evaluate and improve our own current team. And so that's kind of what my challenge for you is to start thinking through how do you evaluate your team? How do you be more intentional about the types of interventions that you're bringing into your team and helping ways to correct for your team to help make you more effective? So we're going to jump into a set of questions now. I see there's a couple coming through already. We'll definitely open up a bit more. I've actually pushed out a blog post this morning, which highlights basically everything I've covered today. So if you head over to medium.com/RogerNort or rogernort.medium.com, either one works. The latest post is exactly this, with a bunch more details and examples, and I've linked off to a bunch of resources and tools and frameworks and things that can help with that as well. Otherwise, if you want to engage with me further, Twitter is my poison of choice, and then just the link to the ToolsDB and my website if you want to reach out and chat later. But should we dive into some questions? Joz or Diesel, I don't know if you've got your power back.
Hi, Roger. It's Justin here. Liesel just asked me to step in because she's having some connection problems. That question around who should decide agile methodology was actually from Liesel. Any questions from anyone in the chat?
Which principle did I leave off the list? How do you think I could make this richer? And was that useful? No questions?
From my side, I liked what you said about accountability versus, now it slipped my mind,
responsibility. Ability to respond versus ability to be held to account.
Yeah. I thought that was a very useful thing to make that distinction because, and as you said, being consistent about who falls, who that belongs to.
Yeah.
Otherwise, those things get lost in the mire, don't they? Especially on really large projects. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, I think, and even just like often you enter a team and there's one person who's accountable for everything, and that also doesn't really help either, right? It's like,
yes, exactly.
He's the CEO, ultimately the CEO is accountable, but if he's always being the person accountable, if his neck is always on the line, that's also not very empowering for the rest of the team. So how do you actually find ways of identifying that and delegating to different teams?
Yeah. Delegating is a crucial element. Yeah, giving people on your team the responsibility to be accountable, if I can.
A lot of these tools and frameworks is normally most effective in trying to better manage up. So how do you come in, instead of telling your CEO boss why they're wrong, come in and unpack why they kind of unpack with a framework around how you think the team could be better and kind of inadvertently affect on what they look like.
Right. Some questions from Tammy. Any tips on distributing accountability?
Distributing accountability. That's an interesting one. Yeah, I think the first, there would be two foundational layers that I try and build before you actually action it. The first one is to acknowledge first one is acknowledge that distributed accountability would be valuable, and trying to get buy-in on why that might be valuable for the team. So thinking about, like, is the person who's always accountable, are they overloaded? Is there a culture in the organization of people wanting to look good or wanting to take accountability when they're ahead or not take accountability when they're not? And how do you share that and how empower the team? So there's a cultural element that you need to assess first, in that setting the right environment is going to be pretty critical. The second one is then to assess, well, who is actually accountable for all the things that we need to be held accountable for. So doing a bit of an audit around, like, what are the things that somebody could be held accountable to? So looking at every task, or every maybe a task is too fine-grained, but looking at your epics or looking at your sort of like big milestones, big deliverables, who is the accountable person for each of those things? And how can we distribute that amongst the team? Who has the most context, or who has the information, who can best make those decisions, that can actually be accountable and responsible for that? So it's more just, I would start with like identifying whether culturally you need to actually shift the conversation, shift the context and the framework before you can even action that. But assuming that people do acknowledge that shared accountability is good, distributed accountability, then it's to actually look at doing an audit of, well, where is the accountability currently sitting? And then reflecting on how can we separate that, or how do we move that into different areas.
Great, thank you. From Michelle, not so much a question, but a thought. 90% of your tools are typically what I've used in the past as a UX strategist, but I've really struggled to get buy-in for these in an agile environment. Any thoughts on that?
That's an interesting one. I would say these are all very much agile tools. I'm very biased in that world. So yeah, I'm not sure why agile would not like almost any of those tools that I've discussed. Yeah, I think I would look at like why you can't get buy-in. Like what is it that's actually stopping the buy-in? I find like the whole point of agile, as soon as if you follow any agile framework too strictly, you're actually not being agile, which is kind of the antithesis of the whole point. Like one place, often teams that say they're agile aren't really. And a good point of reflection is the Agile Manifesto. Sort of go back to the source. If you think about where agile came from, it was kind of the amalgamation of a whole bunch of different approaches, products of back then it was project management approaches, like sort of XP, and they had like a number of different ways of thinking about how to do software, deliver value, and deliver software projects. They kind of came together initially as the lightweight, and they didn't want to be lightweight practitioners, so they renamed to agile. But the language of agile is very broad, and it's actually quite a broad church. So I would challenge to like identify which flavor of agile is kind of rubbing up against that, and then identify like what are the constraints of that particular flavor, of that particular approach. Like, are you trying to be too Scrum? In which case you're not flexible enough, you're not responding to change enough. Like each of those frameworks have a weakness as well. And if your team is struggling at that inherently, maybe it's time to change your way of work or change your tools because of that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, sorry, I think agile is predominantly from software delivery more than UX and research. So I would say it's that sort of came from beyond it. Look, I think the evolution of a lot of that is kind of thinking around product principles. And I sort of see product as the evolution, the same way design moved from or started back in 2000s was there were flyers and graphic designers, then they made static web pages, then they realized they could make buttons and flavors, and then it developed into a web app, and then we got a UI and UX started separating, and then you had information architecture, and then it developed into design thinking, and it's now become an approach in how you think about design and about usability of an element. And that's kind of been the evolution of design over the last 20, 25 years. And I think product is just a couple of steps earlier on that stage, where it's really been built on sort of design thinking, the lean startup, on sort of like software delivery. It's looking at like how we unpack business value. And so product and the principles behind product is based on a lot of those same core elements and same core building blocks. And we're starting to evolve. Instead of focusing on product the thing of what is the thing that we're going to build, we're focusing more on product the way, which is how the way in which we build and deliver value and the way in which we build and deliver products. Because if you can help a team identify a better way of delivering value, you're going to continually deliver many great things. If you help a team just focus on delivering one great product, just focus on the thing, then they're going to build that thing, and then they're going to kind of get stuck and stop iterating from that. But if you can focus on the way in which the team communicates, collaborates, and makes decisions, you're going to have a high functioning team, and they're going to continue to deliver and improve on many great things. And so that's kind of the shift that I see. And sort of there's a lot of parallels here, but I see as product is kind of been standing on the shoulder of giants, standing on the shoulder of design and UX from that.
Right. I think something from that speaks similarly to what you've just been saying.
Yeah.
But also asks, how do we decide if features are delivering value?
Yeah, there's a really great.
That's quite a question.
Yeah, it's a little close to home. No, it's the easiest hack that I have for looking at this is when if you've done a PRD or if you've done some kind of scoping document or somewhere at the beginning of a product, when you justified why we should build this feature, there was a hypothesis about the value it would have. There was some kind of measure of we think it's going to increase revenue, or it's going to have this uptick in users, or we should unlock a new user type. And so what's a really useful a practice for a product manager or product designers is to go back and reflect on what did we ship in the last 6 months? What was the intended impact? What impact did we think we would have at that time? And you kind of use those documents or those stakes in the ground as your hypothesis. I mean, they kind of defined your experiment, right? Like what you thought would be true, what you would test is build this feature. You're going to measure this is the impact, and this would be a success criteria. Often they don't quite have success criteria, but there'll be some kind of indication. And reflecting back on your backlog and seeing, like every time you ship a feature, 1 month later, reflect back and say, has this hit what we thought it would hit when we scoped it or not? And so reflecting, looking through the backlog, very, very often we're just focused on what are the team building next, and can we keep feeding this hungry beast, that we stop to actually reflect on, are we building the right thing? And are we building the things right? Like those are kind of the loop that we need to run through. But the reflection back on what has been delivered and whether that actually had the impact we thought is a step that we most often miss. And so that's what I would recommend.
Okay, great, thanks. Another one from Liesel around accountability and responsibility, that it's role-based in terms of what she understands, and how do you go about assigning those kinds of roles and responsibilities? I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, as in it shouldn't be the CEO alone.
I think you can also delegate it by who has the most context or who has the most up-to-date information on it, and let that person have the accountability for what gets delivered, and then they are responsible for sharing that information or pulling in whoever needs to be pulled in order to do that. I mean, just in my current company about 3 weeks ago, we had a Twilio bill that was going to jump from $500 a month to $5,500 in a week, and then keep climbing at that rate. And the person with the most context was a mid-level product manager, and the CEO turned to him and said, well, you've got the most context on this, you're running the numbers, you make the call, you tell us whether we should turn it off or not, or whether we should do something else. So it's partly a cultural thing, but acknowledging the accountability and responsibilities is sort of the first step of actually being able to make change or change the culture or change the perspective around it.
Right, great, thanks. Something from Brad on shaping, from Shape Up. If I recall, that's the Basecamp book.
Yeah, Brad, I don't know if you can.
With it.
I haven't read the Basecamp book. The shaping. Yeah, we did look at this. I read an article on this a little while ago. I see this just as like it's just another approach. There's pros and cons to it. don't believe any approach is a be all and end all for all teams. It's just a matter of what works for your team. And if your team is already good at an area, I can't remember the exact details around shaping and what its characteristics are, but like I would look at shaping and reflect on which one of these principles is it going to enhance, which one is it going to make us better at, and then are those the areas that your team is weak at? If not, then adding another framework to do something that you're already doing pretty well is going to be minimal returns. Try and focus, find something to improve in the better. Like, are you chatting to customers every week? That's probably going to have a much bigger impact in your delivery than adopting the latest tool.
I have
Cool.
any other questions from anyone?
Last question, anyone?
Dominique says that's a lot of vinyl. Yes, it is. I have one.
Yes.
These processes we speak about in a I don't want to say abstract way, but in a theoretical way often, right? And I think they apply. I think they're a lot easier to apply when you own your own product. So you're a product, you're a company, you have a product, you build that, you have a team, and that's what you're focused on. Do you have any kind of perhaps ideas or tips on how to get these kinds of processes really honed in a company that's more of a service kind of business, where you might have 6 or 7 clients and you've got this team is on that client and this team is on that client? And that's something that we definitely struggle with in terms of having a coherent process around design to dev to QA to etc.
Yeah,
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, when you're placing teams in clients, it helps to reflect on these things within the context of the client, right? Each one of your teams is operating within a different context. They're probably building a different type of product. Some clients will be super demanding, some will be super understanding, some will delegate the authority, some will tell you exactly what you need to build and expect you to deliver it. So the first step would just be once a month or once every 2 months or whatever it is, part of the retro, have your team rate for this project, how are we doing on these 10 items? Like, rate yourselves, and are we getting better or worse? And then, hey, we're really bad at these areas. Let's escalate to the CEO to chat to the client to say, hey, you need to back off on these things. Here's why we know better. Here's why our experience has helped us deliver stuff faster, and your approach is making us deliver slower. I've often found, like, even just like by making that uncertainty clear, like as I use that example, that's literally something I developed with my customers, because they didn't. Everyone comes in and says, just tell me how much it's going to cost and when it's going to be shipped by, and they don't understand why that's a difficult question to answer. But by quoting in a range, you start bringing the conversation towards, well, why? Well, this is why it's hard. This is what I'm struggling with, and you kind of make those inefficiencies obvious, and you can actually have a conversation about it. And so in every one of these, there's going to be a way in which, like, if we don't get this right, what can go wrong? And then how do we communicate that the current way of working is likely to end that path, and that we should probably make these kinds of interventions in order to increase the odds of delivering a better, more valuable output. But yeah, some clients it's difficult.
Right. Thanks.
That's why I don't have any hair.
Yeah, that's my mind's going. Last question from Kate around accountability and responsibility, and then the impacts on budgets when you have to take accountability and responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to so I think just separating accountability and responsibility. I think something like a lack of budget is not like the person no longer has the ability to respond. Like that's the one thing. So when it comes to responsibility, like that's out of it. When it comes to accountability, the person who's accountable if this doesn't go wrong, if you're accountable, you need to be thinking about what are the risks that could kill this project? What are the flags that I need to be looking for in why I need to do that? And so there's a bit of a framework around thinking through, like, how do we actually delegate accountability? When somebody is accountable, what does that actually mean? And having budget to actually deliver is absolutely something that person needs to be aware of. And when they become aware of, hey, we're not going to get the budget, how do you communicate that and manage that as effectively as possible? How do you have that conversation before you know you're running out of budget, that you're probably not going to deliver the value in the time? How are you measuring that? So I would throw that all on the accountability person's accountable person's neck and say that is something that they should be evaluating if that is a potential constraint in what they're needing to do.
Right.
But the person who's responsible, as soon as the budget runs out, that responsibility gets taken away and given to the CFO or to the CEO, or whoever it is, because the person can't respond.
Very true. Yeah. Great. Well, I think we can call it an evening. Thanks so much for your time, Roger. Really appreciate it. That was fascinating, very valuable, as people have said in the comments. So thank you so much for giving us your time. Just in terms of our next events, there will be a ZAPD Zapped workshop in July. Topic to be things just to be finalized around that. So keep an eye out on the meetup announcements. And then, of course, as you know, Zapped and FEDSA are very close together. So FEDSA next in July, we have a talk on front-end testing for accessibility. And then in August, we will be doing part 2 of our What's New in CSS workshop that we ran this past weekend. So keep an eye out for those as well. Yeah. And just finally, thanks again to Roger. Much appreciate your time, as I said, and thanks to everyone who joined us. This, of course, will be up on our YouTube channel. It takes about 24 hours to do all the rendering and whatnot. We always share it in the ZAPD Slack and in the ZA Tech Slack. And please share far and wide if you can. It's always great to get as many eyes on these kinds of talks as possible. So, yeah, thanks everyone, and we'll see you next one.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.